You mentioned that people started to create tipping points strategically.
This time around, I was a lot more concerned about the way in which people are using these principles in ways that are not socially positive.
One of the most powerful story in this book was about opioid crisis, and
The doctors who started it was no more than a couple of hundred doctors at the start of this epidemic. This particular prescription drug, and it moved the same population who got addicted to the prescription drug, then moved into heroin and then fentanyl.
so people may be tipping the system without realizing it, and platforms seem to amplify that effect when
Yeah.
traditional gatekeepers lose control. 皆さんこんにちは。ピボットの野島です。最近ニュースや SNS を見ていて、たった一つの発言だったり行動が社会の空気をなんか変えたなと感じた瞬間ってなかったでしょうか？そういったタイミングのことを英語でティッピングポイント、社会が傾き始める点と呼ばれるんですね。今日お迎えするのはその言葉を世界中に25年前に広めた世界的大ベストセラー作家、マルコムグラッドウェルさんです。彼はほんの少数の人々が大きな変化を生むという、論を提唱されたわけなんですが、その25年後経った今、その理論がちょっと誤解され、悪用されてるみたいなこともお話しされてるんですね。新しい本の中では SNS、構造、メディア、そしてあなた自身の振る舞いが誰かを、そして社会を傾かせる力になっているかもしれないというところまで示唆に富んでいましたので、今日はその変化の意味を本人にじっくり聞いていきたいと思います。So, Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. So let's go dive in. So the tipping point had a huge impact when it was published. I'm 28 years old, but I remember that. And you introduced a simple but powerful idea that a few people under the certain condition could start massive change. Could you briefly remind us what was the original theory?
Yeah, it was the idea behind the tipping point was that we could use the theory and language of epidemiology, of the study of epidemics of disease, of contagious epidemics, and apply them to the movement of ideas. And at the time I wrote that book 25 years ago, that was a pretty novel idea. People now it's commonplace. We talk about ideas going viral all the time, but back then it was somewhat novel to kind of argue that the way in which a virus moved through a population could teach us about the way in which ideas and behaviors move through a population.
And we kind of learn it from COVID-19 as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, COVID again, all of these disease epidemics, it's really striking how structurally they resemble so many other forms of contagious interaction. I can go into the theory has many parts, but for example, at the core of it is the idea that epidemics of disease are profoundly asymmetrical. Not everyone plays an equal role in spreading disease. Some people play a huge role, some people play a small role. And we saw that with COVID. COVID was profoundly asymmetrical epidemic. And I think that was one of the basic insights of the first Tipping Point book was there are people who play these outside roles. Who are they? How do we find them? What is it about them that makes them special?
And that message inspired many of us, including me. And what made you revisit 25 years later? And what did you want to tell in today's book?
Yeah. Well, it began as a simple attempt it was the 25th anniversary of the book, and I thought it'd be fun to just do a new version, an updated version. And then I got halfway through and I realized I really wanted to write a whole new book. That there was something profoundly interesting to me about the present moment, that somehow the ideas I had been writing about 25 years ago seemed even more topical today. And I realized I had many more things to say. And I realized that so much had happened in the intervening 25 years. We'd seen the internet grow up. We'd seen COVID pandemic sweep the world. We'd seen an epidemic of opioids, particularly in the West, caused millions of people to die. There've been all of these things that have been happening around the theme of contagion. And I felt it would be really interesting to revisit the subject and kind of incorporate a lot of what we've learned and experienced over the last 25 years.
So this new book isn't just an update. And you mentioned that people started to create tipping points strategically. So should we take that as a kind of warning, or what do you say?
Well, a lot of, the first time around, the book was very hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
The original tipping point was intended to be a kind of textbook for people who wanted to create what I call positive epidemics, to bring about change for the good, use the laws of contagion to create positive behaviors and ideas. This time around, I was a lot more concerned about the way in which people are using these principles in ways that are not socially positive. So there's a big chapter on the opioid crisis in the West, particularly in America, and how a single pharmaceutical company very cynically and brilliantly, but ultimately, in a way that was quite sinister, used the ideas of epidemic contagion to create an epidemic around their own very dangerous drug. And that, that is quite an alarming chapter. And I think it speaks to how these principles can be used for both good and for ill.
Exactly. I believe one of the most powerful story in this book was about opioid crisis, but Japanese viewers may not be familiar with this case. Could you help us understand what happened exactly?
Yeah, one of the worst public health crises in the history of the United States has unfolded over the last 25 years. And it was triggered by an American drug company called Purdue, which came up with a new and very powerful painkiller, an opioid, and marketed it more aggressively than any painkiller has ever been marketed. And it had the effect of triggering an epidemic of drug overdoses. People didn't use it in the way they were supposed to use it, and started to get addicted to it and overdosed in extraordinary numbers. I mean, we're now in the United States, somewhere close to 100,000 people die of drug overdoses every year. And it began as centered on this particular drug, this particular prescription drug, and it moved the same population who got addicted to the prescription drug, then moved into heroin and then fentanyl. And so it's had several waves, but it all began with this drug called OxyContin, which was produced by this company, Purdue. And so what I do in that chapter is I go into exactly what did this company do to create an epidemic around their drug. And what they did was they very precisely and brilliantly and found and targeted doctors who they felt were likely to prescribe this drug in far greater than normal quantities, who could be manipulated by sales forces and convinced to basically give everyone who wanted this drug as much as they wanted. And that's what started the epidemic. And it all began with the company recognizing that only a small number of people are necessary to start an epidemic. That was their insight. They didn't have to market to every doctor in America. They just needed to find out which doctors played key roles in sparking these kinds of negative epidemics.
So that was the 3 rules: the role of the few, the stickiness factor, and the power of the context. That was kind of...
Yeah, they were using the first of those, the law of the few. They understood that, in fact, it turns out that this epidemic, which has so far claimed the lives of well over 1 million Americans, the doctors who started it was no more than a couple of hundred doctors at the start of this epidemic. So there are hundreds of thousands of doctors in the United States. Most of them had nothing to do with it. Purdue understood that you only needed about 1,000 to do your bidding if you wanted to start an epidemic around OxyContin.
So this wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a design tipping point using influence to change behavior at scale.
Exactly. It
Mhm.
was, if they were using it to sell sneakers or t-shirts or perfume, we would applaud them. But they were using it to sell a deadly drug, a deadly addictive drug.
So this story is like really heartbreaking. But I want to ask, was this about a bot company misusing influence, or was it about a system that allowed it to happen? Where does the real responsibility lie?
I think it lies in a number of different places, but it does begin with a company that was reckless, that didn't appreciate or admit to itself how dangerous its drug was,
Mhm.
and didn't understand the consequences of, the doctors they were using were doctors who had all kinds of personal problems, who were highly susceptible to pressure from salespeople, who were easily manipulated, and they were very cynically preying on doctors who had all kinds of problems and who were not very good doctors. So there was an element here of, we rely on particularly drug companies to conduct themselves in an ethical manner, and they have to, they have to police themselves to a certain extent. And this company did not police itself.
Mhm.
So that was the core of the problem.
And do you think this kind of engineered tipping or manipulated tipping is something we're surrounded by without even noticing?
I think it's something we're likely to see more and more of,
Mm.
because I think what the internet and AI have given us are tools that allow us to find these kinds of powerful influencers much more easily.
Right.
We have databases now where you can see who are the doctors who are prescribing drugs in large quantities. Where do they live? What are their weaknesses? What are their past prescribing patterns? We have all of this data now, and we can sort that data and analyze it very, very easily and cheaply. And that opens the door to people, I think,
Mm.
to kind of construct these epidemic strategies that were very hard to construct a generation ago.
Did you expect tipping points to be kind of misused or, I don't know, manipulated?
It's hard to say. I mean, in the back of my mind, I always thought when I wrote the original book, there would be this possibility that people would be using epidemic principles for less than positive goals. But I was more excited about the positive uses. And I still remain.
Mm.
I still think that these principles will be used more for good than for evil. I remain an optimist about that.
Mm.
But it's just that, there are these examples that come along of people who kind of take the opposite strategy. So I think it's true. What I'm describing are tools. It's always the case that a tool could be used in any number of different ways.
So, Malcolm, let's go one step deeper. So sometimes like tipping point isn't triggered by people, but by structure, you say. So you call them over stories in this book, quiet systems that shape behavior. Could you walk us through the
Yeah.
Harvard example too?
Yeah. Yeah. I became very struck in writing this book by the idea that the shared values that communities have appear to play a really important and powerful role in shaping behavior
Mm.
and in creating these kinds of contagions. And I give a variety of examples throughout the book, but one was about a very wealthy community that had a suicide crisis, a teen suicide contagion that lasted for about 15 years, where it was a whole cluster of suicides. Teenagers were picking up this suicide idea from their peers and repeating the behavior in very tragic ways. I was trying to understand it was a crisis that was confined to a very specific town that had really to one high school in a town. And the town had a very specific profile. It was a very wealthy, self-contained, proud, close-knit town. And so it was a little microcosm. And within that tight-knit town, a set of ideas took hold that were very difficult to shake. And in analyzing that town has been studied by sociologists. And in analyzing it, I was very impressed by how much the values and ideas that are held by a specific community can influence the behavior of people within that community in ways they're not aware of. And that was the crucial thing, that people didn't understand this was happening. They didn't understand the extent to which they were being influenced by these shared set of unstated values. And then I gave other examples throughout the book of how overstories have shaped behavior. I looked at how doctors, how a doctor behaves, their willingness to diagnose disease, their willingness to prescribe certain drugs, their willingness to perform certain procedures is powerfully influenced by the town or community in which they practice. It's not it's influenced far more than that, than where they trained as doctors, or where they were educated as doctors, or their own personal profile. Turns out that where you live makes a huge difference to how you behave as a doctor. And that's another example of the same thing, that when doctors are practicing together in a community, they appear to be influenced by the values of that community in ways they are not aware of. And then I have a chapter about Harvard. I talk about elite colleges in the United States. And now they have the same pattern. They have these implicit ideas that they share about who they want to be. And they go to extraordinary lengths to kind of embody these ideas in the composition of their student body.
So like the policies that seems fair can shape outcomes without even noticing.
Yeah. I mean, it's that the thing that links together all those examples is that people aren't aware of it. These are influences that are happening on an unconscious level. And I have a chapter about how America changed its mind about gay marriage very quickly. It went from being something that was politically people thought was impossible to something that just became accepted by a huge majority of Americans. That change happened almost overnight. And I argued that it was because there were some television shows that were portraying gay couples in a very positive manner. People weren't aware that they were being influenced in that way. And they even kind of forgot that a few years earlier, they had been strongly opposed to gay marriage. They just kind of changed their mind. They kind of woke up one morning and didn't feel strongly about it anymore, and didn't realize that they had changed their perspective. And it was something that was completely astonishing to people who were fighting for gay marriage. They didn't anticipate this at all. But this is another example of how contagion can work on an unconscious level.
So we're not just being tipped by what we hear, and we're also being tipped by what we're allowed to believe is normal or fair. And sometimes the system designed to prevent tipping end up feeling disconnected from like how influence actually moves. So let me ask about one such kind of example happening in Japan. Our election coverage has strict equal time rules. Like every party gets the same airtime regardless of their size. But now smaller or outsider parties are gaining real influence through social media, like completely bypassing traditional media. So what's striking me is it seems that many of their messages weren't viral from the start. They grew after being reposted and amplified by trusting figures on platforms like X or YouTube. Is that kind of thing middle influencer, you mean people who quietly accelerate tipping points?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a classic example of how an epidemic works. One of the things I was very interested in my first book was describing what social power is. And what's interesting about social power is that it is quite distinct from political power or institutional power or economic power. It's a separate category. And what you're describing is exactly that notion, that a set of rules that governed how influence was supposed to work institutionally. But influence doesn't always work through institutions. Sometimes it just works through the kind of social connections informal social ties people have with one another. And what social media has allowed outsiders to do, people who don't have access to institutional power, just to bypass the system, as you said, and to kind of simply work these social networks to their own advantage. And that's very much, epidemics of disease don't work through formal structures. They work entirely through informal structures. You get infected by people you meet casually, by friends and family, by, it's not, you don't go to a specific place and get infected. It's the result of the kind of patchwork of relationships you have in your life and patterns in your own life. And so now we're seeing that's a classic example of what you're describing of ideas following the same informal pathways that disease epidemics have always followed.
So that's kind of the quiet power of middle influencers. They don't create the wave, but they give it direction.
Yes, exactly. I think that they're an amplification. They and a certain kind of credibility as well. They're playing all the roles. I in my first book I talked about mavens, connectors, and salespeople, and the idea that the maven is a person who has credibility in a given area. The connector is a person who has reach, and the salesman is a person who has persuasion. And those are all the qualities that informal social contagion requires. And so social influencers now are people who are using social media, which is a connecting platform, and who have acquired credibility and persuasiveness through their own personal qualities. And that combination makes them very powerful.
So people may be tipping the system without realizing it, and platforms seem to amplify that effect. When traditional gatekeepers lose control, then how do we tell the differences between a real tipping point and just a burst of online noises?
Well, we look at duration. So the thing about a real epidemic and an epidemic of disease is that it has real duration. These are things that, a pandemic, think about how long it took COVID to kind of dissipate. Very long time. We're talking years. Every year the flu comes, it arrives in the fall, and it doesn't really dissipate until the spring. So it's around so these are not, the thing that marks a true epidemic, I think, is not just its reach, but its duration. So we can tell the difference between these kinds of flash in the pan false epidemics and real ones by just saying how deeply rooted are they? How difficult are they to kind of dislodge? And how far do they travel?
I see. So that's not about how loud something is. It's about whether it actually changes belief or behavior.
Yeah. And how, in the chapter of my recent book, when I talk about the way people change their minds about the Holocaust, what's striking about that is that it swept that idea that, that chapter is all about how prior to the late 1970s, the Holocaust just simply was never talked about. And then after the end of the 1970s, because of a series of things, principally a television show, people started to talk about it all the time. And what's interesting about that is that that was a change that swept the entire world. It wasn't confined to one area. And it was a lasting change. It has persisted to this day. And so, that's what you're looking for is, although it had a kind of relatively modest beginning and it took us all by surprise and happened very quickly, it stayed and it spread. And that's what makes it something, I think, that those are the markers of a true, profound behavioral shift.
When I was reading that part, Holocaust part, I was like, how did Mr. Gladwell find this out? I mean, how did you know?
So I was just reading a friend of mine whose aunt had been a Holocaust survivor, just mentioned in passing that no one used to talk about it. I was like, really? He said, yeah, my aunt, he had several cousins who were Holocaust survivors. He said they never mentioned it. and none of their friends did either. He said, you should go back and look at how often it was mentioned in the 60s and 70s. And so I did it. And that's what got me going and then I realized people had written about this, historians had written about this phenomenon.
And as someone working in the media industry, this conversation really stuck me. And we tell story, we create frame. What would you say to those us in the media industry?
I would say it's good it's useful to be, I think, mindful of our power. We're more than simply, our job is more than simply to impart information. We do participate and in some cases initiate these kinds of epidemics, even without realizing it. And I think that is a kind of, that should remind us to take our job seriously. It's a simple, very simple lesson, but anyone who's engaged in storytelling and information spreading is potentially playing a kind of epidemic role. And so they need to, it's why when people spread disinformation online, it's why that's so reckless, because the medium is really powerful and really contagious. And you need to exercise some discretion in how you use it.
I'll keep that in mind. And I'll ask not just what happened, but who wants this story tipped and why.
Yeah, that's a useful lesson.
Thank you. And Malcolm, everyone who reads this book will ask, so what should I do differently? What should I do next? What's your answer?
Yeah. Based on having read it, I just think we need to, this was an idea that was present in the first book as well, which is that we have difficulty with the idea of the epidemic because we think in a linear fashion. We think that there is a kind of constant relationship between inputs and outputs. We don't understand that things can become amplified and spread in the way that contagious ideas and viruses spread. It always takes us by surprise. And I think that's what we have to do, I think, is internalize that idea that sometimes things get turbocharged and can spread around the world, overnight. COVID went from a corner of China to the entire world in a couple of weeks, right? And it took us by surprise, even though that exact same thing has happened over and over and over and over again in human history. And that's, to me, I find that fascinating that this is a lesson we simply can't learn. And so we need to kind of do a better job of internalizing the kind of lessons of nonlinearity.
Can we do that? Can we use it wisely next time?
Yeah, I'm an optimist. I've always been an optimist.
So Malcolm, this has been truly enlightening. So thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about. Thank you again. Sure. And actually, I'll be looking for your update maybe 25 years later. Can we count on that?
Yes. I'll be an old man, but yes, maybe I'll do that.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye now.